Hello again. There can be no doubt at all that some of us come from wealthier and better connected families than others. Nor can anybody deny that some people today are poorer than others because of what has happened over the years to their ancestors. Getting rid of these inequalities, though, is not really a practical proposition. In parts of England and Wales, there are working class families whose grandfathers and great grandfathers were miners, and some of these families are not very well off today because those men worked hard for an employer and were not paid very much. There are also families living in those same areas which are well to do and wealthy, and sometimes this is because their ancestors owned coal mines and factories which exploited working people and helped them build up fortunes from their labours. There's little we can do about it at this late stage other than to try and ensure that opportunities are more readily available to everybody now to study and get good jobs without social class and family wealth giving an advantage in getting into university or the professions, for example. We can hardly take money from people today whose ancestors happened to own a factory in Victorian Britain and then give it to the descendants of the people who worked in that factory. Working out who was owed what would be a nightmare, an impossible nightmare. My family were not very well off, and from researching my family tree, I can see that this has been always the case, at least right back to the 18th century. Both my grandmothers went out charing, even after they had officially retired, to make ends meet. And from looking at census records, so too did their mothers and grandmothers. Charwoman seems to have been the default occupation for my female ancestors. My family history contains nothing but manual workers and the occasional quaintly named pauper lunatic. Perhaps those whose family trees contain factory owners and shipbuilders ought to give some of their money to me to compensate me for having such poor dead relatives. Put like that, of course, it sounds quite nuts. The past was a very unfair place and there was a lot more inequality than there is now, with many people being poor, undernourished and living in shocking conditions, while others had easy lives in the lap of luxury. This terrible inequality applied not only in Britain but also in the islands of the Caribbean, with some people, mainly white, being extremely rich and others, mainly black, being very, very poor. The idea is now gaining strength in some of the islands, Grenada for example, that the British government should give a lot of money to the country to make up for this injustice during the 18th and early 19th centuries. This idea is every bit as mad as that of compensating me and other people from working class families for being exploited by landowners and bosses in the years before Queen Victoria came to the throne. Slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, by the way, 5 years before Victoria became Queen. It was a very, very long time ago. Calls are becoming increasingly strident in the United States as well for this kind of scheme, and there it is suggested that a cash payment should be made to every black person who is a descendant of slaves. A figure of $250,000 to each person has been suggested as fair compensation. Many white people, both in Britain and America, have been manipulated into feeling guilty about the colour of their skin, and with the current absurd enthusiasm for all things black, I can see that something of this sort might very well get going. I, for one, am likely to feel mighty aggrieved if compensation is offered to black people for stuff which happened to their families centuries ago, but working families like my own are overlooked. The conditions under which miners and labourers worked in 18th century Britain were little better than slavery, and in Scotland they actually were tantamount to slavery, but I think I need to make a separate video about that. It's an interesting subject. I certainly think that if reparations are to be made to one exploited group of workers, then it should be part of a broader and more general settlement for past injustice. I really don't see why black people should be singled out.